Okay, there we go. So the reason why we have to segregate these issues, I'm sorry, everybody, is okay, that there we go. So the reason why we have to segregate these issues, I'm sorry, everybody, is that before about 1990, these were typical of male serial killers. But since we've seen since 1990, there has been similar serial killers amongst women. And so in the analysis that I'm providing, just keep this in mind, okay? So there's 4 types, basically, of serial killers. And if you remember right, we're talking about individuals from the FBI's definition who have killed in 3 or more separate events at 3 or more separate locations and have engaged in some emotional cooling that I defined last time we met. So just keep those concepts in mind. And so what do we see with the majority of male serial killers? And when I say the majority, I'm saying most and all, okay? So when we talk about visionary serial killers, this is when the serial killer feels impelled to commit the murder by a vision or some voice in their head. And probably the best example of this is Charles Manson. Charles Manson, sorry. Where he was not directly involved in the serial killings that he did, but he created a family who would do his bidding. The voices that were created in his head that said, hey, Charles, you would be this amazing composer, this popular music person, was created because when he took the shrooms, the opioids, and the stimulants he did within his family unit, those were the visions that he saw. Is they were very much about what would make him famous was if his family, which he would eventually amass and would believe in him, would kill these certain people and create this certain chaos where Charles Manson would become this famous individual. When we talk about a mission-oriented killer, we're talking about a person who feels it's to be their mission to kill a certain types of person. So probably the popular serial killer is Joseph Franklin, who in the 1930s, he was originally part of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, who thought that Black people would bring upon the apocalypse. And so he thought it was his mission to end their life. Now, I want to make it clear, with the missionary and the visionary serial killers, they were the same elements that will go into the hedonistic power control in combination of all of these individuals that we're going to get into. Because when you look at the visionary and you look at the mission-oriented killers, you would assume that they had a purpose. But their purpose was aimed towards the two other categories that we're going to talk about. The third one is a hedonistic serial killer. This is someone who gets a pure thrill out of the act of murder. The person who represents this would be probably Jeffrey Dahmer, who got a thrill. Okay, let's go back just a moment with Jeffrey Dahmer, because maybe everyone or most people have seen the documentary, all those things on Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was a gay male. He also was fascinated with anatomy. And so what he wanted to know is what made people who they were. And his thrill out of killing and savoring those portions of those individuals was because he got a thrill out of those killings. He wanted that possession of those individuals. And so the reason why I'm differentiating between Jeffrey Dahmer as a hedonistic serial killer versus a power control killer is Jeffrey Dahmer wanted that sensation he could not get because his family expected him to be heterosexual. They expected him to have sexual fantasies about a female. But in the end, he didn't understand the conflict that his parents created. And so the only thrill he got out of killing was hedonistic. It was just that pure thrill out of it. The power and control killer, on the other hand, gains more satisfaction from the exercise of completing the power over his victim. And I will say this, per victim, in situations dealing with females over since 1990. The power and control person gets satisfaction out of the sexual activity that almost always is involved. They take control over the situation. They enjoy the power they have over someone else. And this is a good example of John Wayne Gacy, who, again, he murdered other males. He did it not for the same reason Jeffrey Dahmer did. Jeffrey Dahmer did it out of thrill. John Wayne Gacy did it out of he could have power and control over people who never could have power and control over him, because that was his MO. That was he was actually, if you want to put it in these terms, he was gay, but he never had power and control over his gayness. So he took power and control over those people who were either gay or not gay. They were young men or young boys, but he took that advantage away from them. And then in the last point we have to make is some serial killers did it for dual reasons. So when we get to Ted Bundy, he did it for power and control. He wanted to show he wasn't someone who was going to be rejected by the people he subdued, but he also did it for the pleasure of doing it. And so these are the 4 different reasons. And so let's move on. So these are the 4 different reasons, and keep those in mind. And keeping with Ted Bundy and his multiple reasons, you can see. So he used restraints, power and control. He used strangers as a target. Okay, that's not power and control, that's hedonistic. He couldn't have control over those, but he needed to have pleasure of those. He needed to control the scene, hedonistic. The weapon was planned, hedonistic. They knew what they were going to do it. They needed to have that. But then the body was transported. That means that he needed to show his power and control, but needed to hide the body to allow other people to see how powerful he was. And so, and this is getting into what we're going to do with the profiling situation. We have to understand that there's both organized and disorganized type of serial killers. The organized, if you notice, they plan it. And you can see this on the Canvas page when I post these PowerPoints. It tends to be arson, something they want anybody to notice. The group is targeted. There's shooting involved. It's a very controlled scene, where then we have a disorganized people. These are people on the not so social level of attribution. So we see on the disorganized weapon left at the scene, signs of beating. Victim is usually known. Perpetrator, it usually is killed with a foreign object. You can look at these on the Canvas page, but I just wanted you to know between the organized and disorganized as we get into this conversation. And so this is just another representation that depended upon the person's, let me reword that. Dependent upon the crime scene, you can determine what kind of offender it is. So if we look at the visionary, they tend to be, weapon is improvised, aggressive act, and then the victim tends to be unclothed, and necrophilia. All of those things tend to be present in that individual. But then we look at the hedonistic, those type of things at the victim's crime scene seems to be different. And then as we go down the line of the different types and the different pains that victims go through, it becomes more and more diverse. And this is just another example. It'll be posted on our Canvas web, on our Canvas page, that you can see the different methods. Okay, I have mentioned in the class time and time again that there is a difference between male serial killers and female serial killers. But I have also mentioned since the 1990s, there has been more female serial killers that are more like male serial killers than in the past. So what I want you to read in this slide is that the majority of female serial killers do it for instrumental reasons or twisted notions of mercy. But we're seeing more and more serial killers since the 1990s that do it for a sexual portion of what they're going through. Okay, so to illustrate this, I want to define instrumental versus twisted notions of mercy when it comes to female serial killers, because they're the ones that I know the most about, because those are the ones that I work with when I worked in the prison systems with consultation. So I want to give the difference between the majority of serial killers who do instrumental versus twisted notions of mercy. And I want to give you the version of the two faces that serial killers give. Okay, so I'm going to start with the instrument reasons for killing. I worked with a female serial killer. She didn't have any more alibis or anything, so she was there. She was just waiting for the executioner, which in the state that I worked in was very uncommon, and same with the individual that I also worked with twisted notions of mercy. So I want to give these two examples. The person that I worked with that probably represents instrumental reasons for serial killing was an individual who, if I ever wanted to have an understanding of the Bible, no matter what version, King James, whatever version I wanted, and I went to this person and said, where does the Bible state this? She would give me the King James version, and she would give me every other version, and she'd give me the exact verse, phrase, and page number, regardless of the version of the Bible that was being read. When I met this person, she prayed to the Christian God 5 times a day. She read the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, constantly. She didn't want any other version of the Bible. This person, in her pre-sentencing investigation, which is the investigation that the judge uses to convict a person, how many years they should be in prison, what they should do. The pre-investigation stated in many communities that this person was in, she was a perfect, quote unquote, Christian woman. She was there during every sermon of the preacher or the person that was giving the speech. She would attend every religious gathering. She would bring food. She would provide childcare to anyone who came. And this is the two-faced scenario of the serial killer. On one side, she provided a face of, I am the perfect Christian woman. On the backside, there was the serial killer that killed for instrumental reasons. The reason why it took us so long to connect the dots is she did her murders in several different states. She did it in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. And so all of those systems didn't communicate well. But what came out of this is this person, on because she didn't have any more appeals, stated this to me in a paraphrased form. And I can't direct quote her for professional and ethical reasons, but she stated basically she had an extreme hate for men. She thought men were the evil of the world. So she had a habit, quote unquote, to when she got involved with a man, she got involved with a man with a young boy who was between the age of 9 to 10. And after about 3 years of involvement with these two persons, she would burn the house with the man and the young boy in the house. And most of the investigations thought that she did it for survival benefits, for insurance benefits, but it progressed from Oregon to Washington to Montana to Idaho. And in Idaho, we did a thorough investigation. They did. I shouldn't say I did or anything. And what they found is I want you to think about an 8 to 9 year old boy and what happens 3 years later. They go through puberty. And so for this individual, she was feeling like she was killing two birds with one stone. She allowed a young boy to go through his childhood, and then she destroyed two men, the male that she married or got in a relationship, and the person who was becoming a man, because she had an instrumental reason. She felt that men were the destructors of our world, and that by allowing a young boy to live out his childhood and destroying it when he became a physical man, that would eliminate two birds with one stone, two men with one stone. And so that was her kind of MO for this situation. In the second one, which is Twisted Notions of Mercy, I first need to explain my first experience with prison. I went into prison. I was doing this consultation. They had high suicide rates. They had high issues. And they asked me to come in as a consultant. And when I went into the prison system, I noticed this elderly person. She was probably the stereotype of what we think of a grandma. She had her thing. She was kind. She was, oh, how are you doing? Do I need to give you directions? Blah, blah, blah. And in my naive mind, I initially thought, wow, they let elderly people come in to maybe read to the offenders, help them out with the library, help them out with whatever. That was my naive mind. But later I recognized, well, why do they have volunteers wearing the same outfits as all of the other offenders? She wore the same thing. And I want to bring you up to date on this individual. She was someone who was a person who you would think is a perfect grandma. She knitted other offenders boot stockings and everything else, and we'd have to go and collect them because they were Ganterbond. She would give that grandmotherly advice to other offenders. She was what you would consider the perfect grandma. So in the situation, we have the perfect church woman and we have the perfect grandma. And this is the first thing that I need to note about serial killers. They have two faces, as this diagram or the picture in the diagram of the slide depicts. There's this person that they present to the world, and then there's this person that lies behind that individual who is the murderer, who is the sadistic individual who's going to take someone's life. Okay, and that's the important part about this conversation. When we have a division between who we're supposed to be and who we want to be, that is a perfect condition for these kind of acts to happen. It's called, well, we'll get into it. I'm not going to give the surprise. So what did this individual, the perfect grandma that I ran into, what did she do? She was in the Boise area. And in the Boise area where she lived, there was this playground, this park that then centered around these different living spaces, some apartments, some houses, and all of those kinds of things. And there was this young child, and I apologize about the age. It was between 4 and 6. I can't remember at this point in my life. But this 4 to 6-year-old was in the playground, hooping and hollering and having a fun time in the park and enjoying her experiences. But the individual that I'm talking about went back to our apartment building, took a kitchen knife, went back to the park, slit the young girl's throat, and killed her. Because what she saw was the whooping and hollering and yelling was the young girl suffering. And not only was she suffering, but everyone around her was suffering because of her whooping and hollering and all of those things. And so in this situation, she was giving what's called a twisted notion of mercy. She was ending that young girl's suffering and alleviating the suffering of all the other people in the park. And if this is a graphic illustration, we see this with many nurses who have been mixed up in the serial killing, where they kill an elderly person to end their elderly suffering, or because of the nurse who works in the neonatal care unit, they end the suffering of the infant, so that so that infant doesn't need to suffer for themselves or for anyone else. These are the two female serial killers that I work with. And they did it. One was instrumental, wanted to end what was the cause of human problems, which were men. The other one did it for a twisted of mercy. She did it to end the girl's suffering and everyone in the park suffering. Okay, so these are those two examples. But as I mentioned, and this is an important point to make, and I won't elaborate on these because I did it with the male situation, we are seeing since the 1990s a uprise of male versions type of serial killings when it deals with females. So we see the uprising of visionary females, serial killings. Comfort, of course, does with material gain. They do it for the insurance, blah blah blah. Hedonistic, do it for the pleasure. Power seekers do it for the motivation, and the disciples do it because someone of a male version told them to. The issue that we come with a modern version of female serial killers is most, if not all of these, had a male influence when it came to their propensity to end someone's life. And I can bring this up with the issue of female sex offenders. A lot of people have said that no, a female cannot rape a male. Guess what? They can. As it was described to me, you just take a elongated stick, you stick it up their rear end, as you would say it, you stimulate their prostate, and they have an uncontrollable erection. And the female rapists that had a preference for male would describe the situation as they were in the act of raping a male. Okay. But in whether it is a male or a female, all of these individuals had a male motivation. So I'm going to bring up one of probably the worst female rapists that I worked with. It was an individual who was actually originally addicted to methamphetamine, but when she could not afford her methamphetamine anymore, she went to her male dealer and said, "Hey, I can't afford this. How can I get my next hit?" And the male said, "Well, send me pictures of your daughter." And so she did. Her daughter was 9 years of age at that time, and she was fully clothed. And so that was hit one. Hit two was send me a picture with her shirt not there. The next hit was show me a picture of her completely nude. The next hit was bring her here, let me see her. And over time it was let me see her completely nude. And then another time it was let me touch her, then let me do a sexual act with her. And then at a certain point it was you be involved in the situation. You become part of it. And so the mother, who was both an addict and was being influenced by this male, became part of the sexual act between the dealer, her young daughter, and her. Over time, though, it no longer needed the dealer. She started to sexually offend the daughter's friends who were innocent at the time, without the drug dealer's involvement. And she offended these young girls over and over and tried to go on to other people besides her daughter's friends. And eventually what evolved is her doing the sexual offense on her own. And so when we look at these visionary to disciples and all of these, the thing I want everybody to understand is when it comes to females, there is always in the beginning a male involvement. There's a male persuasion. So even though I talk about females becoming like male offenders, we need to understand that there's a grooming process. And I have not seen a case of female serial killers or female serial rapists that did not did not meet this criteria, where in the initial phases of this process, it didn't involve some male involvement. And so I want to make this very clear at this point when we talk about females and their involvement in these situations, and when it becomes their own process. I will tell you, with that female offender, she's been constantly rejected for parole, and she's still sitting in prison, in a female prison, because of the risk, because of the influence she had. Because of that influence, there's still too much risk of allowing her to the external world. And this is just the same graphic. Again, you could see it on Canvas, that each of these female offenders that we've talked about have their different MOs. There's different situations that get them involved in that. So I just want to bring that up. You can look at it on the Canvas page. The thing that I do want to get into is there is a difference between what we call organized and disorganized offenders. Organized, as you can see, in these three clusters, the weapon was planned, the purpose was planned with strangulation, there was a targeted group. As I mentioned with Bundy, he had a very specific group he wanted. He wanted them, their hair to be parted in the middle. They tended to be young, they tended to be white. And the rape and the restraints were always a part of it. But on the disorganized level, this is where we get into cognition and the person's intent. On the organized level, we have individuals who have the cognitive resources, have the resources to plan their situation. And then we have the disorganized level, where it tends to be very spontaneous. The weapons are spontaneous. The sudden version of violence and the notion of trophy, they need to keep something from the victim, tends to be present. And it always, with a disorganized person, tends to be a spontaneous event with what we call post-mortem mutilation, that the individual does not have the social abilities to understand the individuals, so they continue to mutilate the individuals past their survival rate. Okay, so I just want to bring this up because I'm not going to get into this. This is a personality type when we get into female psychopaths. I'm going to encourage you, if you're interested in this, to look on it on the Canvas website with the presentation to see some of the differences from what we talked about with psychopaths as we define it, which has been majorly on the male version, but this is also what we're finding on the female version. But I want to make sure our time is utilized well. So what I want to bring up is what's called the diaphys stress model. So I'm going to bring up my pen. What we start with is the psychopath. The individual who has a low arousal, they have the prefrontal conditions, they have that rejection from the environment. So we start with the psychopath. And from that psychopath tendency, we see things like so low self-esteem. We see the control issues. We see things like sexual dysfunction, impotency, all of those kinds of things where a person can't get aroused because of the situation. They can't normally be aroused. And so they have what we call a maladaptive coping skill. And this comes from these two, right? If you have a situation where you're not wanted, you're hated for your own existence, you're going to come up with maladaptive coping situations when you come up with things like rejection from another person. We see Dahmer being rejected not only by females but by males, but he was actually homosexual, so he needed this drive. We can see with Ted Bundy, his first rejection was by the first female that he tried to have a relationship, and they tried to. They got married, if you've watched the series and all of those things. But again, he was rejected by that. The child that she bore was not even his. And she tended to, again, going to his MO, had parted hair, long hair, tended to be young, and tended to be that situation. This then allows us to go to a retreat to our family, to our fantasy world, not family world, fantasy world. We all have done this. When we have all given rejection, when we've all experienced a negative situation, we all go to that world. Okay. In my world, my dad was a musician. He could play the guitar. He had a beautiful voice. And so when I tended to be rejected, I'd go to this world where I would play for these people in this musical world, and they would all accept me, and they would all appreciate me. But then after a time period, when I was done with that fantasization, I would come to the real world and say, wait a minute, no, that was just that. And I need to deal with the situation with what it is, whether it's a coworker, whether it was an intimate relationship, whether it was a family relationship. And I came up with these coping strategies that didn't deal with the fantasy I had because of the deficit I felt inside. The difference between that situation and a psychopathic serial killer situation is they retreated to their fantasy world and they could not escape that fantasy world. So what that resulted in is this dissociative state. Remember what I said about the individuals that I worked with, that one had the perfect grandma persona, one had the perfect church woman persona, but behind those personas, there was this individual who could not escape from that fantasy world, that had to fulfill that fantasy world because they couldn't escape it. And this led to the first kill, and that everything that entails. Now, you remember in the beginning of these lectures, I said psychopaths cannot be treated. And so I want to give some understanding to this, because we can go through the psychopath. We can give medication that deals with this low arousal. We can give treatment groups that deal with the self-esteem, self-control. A health provider can help someone with their sexual dysfunction. But regardless of all these treatments we provide, If the first kill has happened, an individual does not need any of these things. And even this one, this dissociative state, to do the second and third killing, fourth killing, fifth killing. Why? Because this first killing was so rewarding to their brain, it became an addiction. Their brain needed that second kill after that emotional cooling. We could correct all of these things, these human deficiencies, but the brain was so addicted to this one, it does not take any of these pre-existing conditions to cause the second, third, fourth killing. And that's why we say, can a serial killer be treated? The answer is no, we don't. We can't. Because we've tried to correct all the conditions that created their addiction, but their addiction is so far more rewarding to the individual that it can't be corrected after the first kill. Okay, and that's something I want everyone in the room to understand. And this is why these individuals, in my opinion, from a sociological perspective, should remain in this situation that they're in a prison for a long period of time, because they're not going to do anything outside of the prison situation, as I've shown throughout these presentations. There's one other situation that I wanted to bring up. Maybe it'll come later. Is I want to bring up, so you remember at the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned what was the most typical type of psychopath that then would lead to serial killing. And I mentioned it was someone who was severely westernized, who came from the westernized culture, and they were going through this industrialized situation where they weren't producing for their own, but they were producing for others. Well, let's go through that checklist. The most typical serial killer is a young man between the age of 20 to 30, industrialization, tended to be a white male, Western culture. Their method of murder tended to be hands-on. Hence, they wanted to feel the life lead from the individual. The victim was from something that they felt like they missed in their life. Hence, Ted Bundy chose young women who had their long hair parted in the middle, because that was his first instance of rejection from someone else in his life. And so if you think about this, and I really want, especially because we're a tribal college, to say, hey, we don't have to lead this lifestyle. We shouldn't be a part of this, because we have a place, we have a tradition, we have a moment in time where these were not things that were expected because of culture. And I just want to bring that point up at this moment in the lecture. We find that there are two subtypes of serial killers. We tend to be sadistic and brutal, commits almost exclusively against women. And we find that there's two types of these individuals, especially when it comes from men. who make up the majority of serial killings. And I've alluded to this in the past, in past slides. We have the organized non-social. Those individuals like Ted Bundy, who was rejected, but he was very sociable, but had these deficits. And we have the disorganized asocial. This probably represents the Dahmers in the world who did not have good social skills, so they looked for opportunities of opportunity. And so it was very a disorganized situation. Okay. The organized non-social usually been indifferent to the well-being of others. They didn't know the individuals. They tend to be very self-centered and narcissistic, as I described earlier in previous lectures. They have the intellectual ability to be very manipulative and cunning. They played upon the deficiencies of others. Because they tend to be intellectual, and because they tend to have, they tend to be able to have a job that isn't located near the scene of the crime. And crimes tend to be very controlled and very methodical. You find the person who has been murdered in a very positioned person. They were placed there on purpose. There tends to be no disorganization with the setting. And this is the reason why I wouldn't want to be murdered by this type of individual, is they do both pre and post-mortem mutilation and torture. They tend to want to see the person suffering, and after they pass, they want to continue that mutilation and torture. They also, so they engage, so this is the organized non-social. Again, they tend to do necrophilia, that's assault against the victim after they pass. They tend to return to the crime scene because their social, the emotional cooling period doesn't hold as long. But these individuals want to also know that they want the community to know the pain they've been through. And so they tend to feel they want to get even with society. And so a lot of these individuals you can actually pick up in videotapes from news releases. They often describe other as a loner by others. They're inexperienced in relationships. They have a hard time with relationships. The crime again is frenzies. They tend to live close to the scene. And weapons of opportunity are usually used with this asocial, disorganized type of criminal. With the disorganized, they tend to have their post-mortem mutilation. There tends to be biting and slashing, especially the breast and genitals. There tends to be insertion of objects. Many times they've been described as just a child who is just inquisitive, and they use the mutilated body as a toy to explore. And again, they return to the crime scene often and continue the mutilation process. Example of this type of individual is these guys actually met in a mental institution, and they talked about their fantasies outside, and they became a group. Odom tended to do the rape, Lawson tended to do the mutilation, and their crime was kidnapping, rape, and mutilation after they were released. And this is a quote from Lawson: "I wanted to cut her body just to emphasize the points that I made. I wanted to cut her body so that she would not look like the person and destroy her morally." Remember, when we go back to the definition of evil, they want to take away their personage and they want to take away their their morality. Now, Lawson in the beginning phases did not rape, but he mentioned that he wanted to destroy the individual physically. And so these are the typologies of this type of individual that we're talking about. Okay. This conversation has taken longer than I thought it would. We're at the end of our conversation, and so I'm going to stop sharing. I do want to answer one question, so I